I can start out without the clicker, but this program grew out of work with the Rathman Family Foundation and also with the Dominican Green MBA program, because we were looking at ways that we could evaluate the value of environmental services and utilization of resources. And I was born and raised in England, and my parents had a rude expression for things that didn't work, and they said that things were completely US, and I think that kind of describes our economic system right now. So what we did is we went looking at conventional economics, DSGE models and all this other stuff, and to see if there was something we could use to come up with a top-down policy predicting model so that people could readily go on without going through all this mind-numbing math and such like that. And so we had a program with a few grad students, and we worked on developing the model. The Rathmans didn't make it easy because they said we all had to use open source software that was available for free, but it was a great deal of fun, and a couple of the students were around here today, one of whom participated in the program. But at this point, I'd like to say thank you to the Rathman Family Foundation, the Banking Institute here, and Dominican, who actually hosted the program. But one of the things that I found that's really annoying is if you go back and read the literature, everybody, when they quote Keynes, and this is 90% of the economists, will say, the long run is a misleading guide to current affairs, in the long run we are all dead. And that's true, but they leave out the most important part of the quote, which is what comes next, which is economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task if in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us when the storm is past, the ocean will be flat again. And so what we're trying to do is come up with simulations that take into account turbulence and some of these other factors. Then the other thing that I found when I started talking to economists is I said, okay, I've gone and looked at the OECD figures, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and anywhere from 70 to 85% of the economies of developed nations come from consumer spending. So why aren't you modeling consumer spending and its effect on economic performance? And you get all these blank looks, and you get talk about growth models, and but nobody's been really looking for that. Yet when you dig back further, you get into the work that was done in the 50s, and there was a lot of work going on about how do we control inflation, maintain full employment. And so that's where I sort of took a point of departure here. I'm going to see if this marvelous technology will work. So just to avoid making things overly complicated on graphs, most of modern economics is based on some form of projection of a historical time series. And so what I've done here is, rather than make it too complicated, I've looked at the increase of turkey feed. We've looked at turkey feed as income here. And so what the bankers will tell us is we've looked at the trend, it's all going straight up and everything's fine. And I'm not the first to use this analogy. Several other people have used it. It's in the Black Swan, Nassim Taleb's book. But they ignore Thanksgiving when the value drops to zero. So basically they're saying all these bonds, all these derivatives are fine, but they're not looking for the unexpected event, the fractal distribution of events. They're all looking at this bell-shaped curve and saying it'll never happen. Now, one economist who had a lot to say about this was Minsky, and he came up with the financial instability hypothesis back in 1992. And he broke debt down into three categories. There's hedged, speculative, and Ponzi debt. And what he said is in prosperous times, bankers will extend more credit to those with less ability to repay until something goes wrong or the financial equivalent of Thanksgiving shows up. So this is what we said about modeling for this talk. I'd love to spend the time talking about what we did with the overall Cambriant model, but that's available on the Dominican's Environmental Finance Center Green MBA website, and we actually have a series of videos there that make things a little bit more understandable. But for purposes of this talk, we're just going to look at stability. So when we look at it in the subprime crisis, traditional borrower, as other speakers have mentioned, 20% down, verifies income, he can make the payments. Then you get to the speculative borrower, and he's only able to pay the interest. Maybe pay the principal. There's no guarantee that he'll be able to pay it. Then we get to the Ponzi borrower, who is only capable of paying teaser rate and negative amortization loans and all those funny instruments that they came up with to feed the commoditization, securitization mill. And he's relying on housing prices continuing to go up and the fact that the banks will refinance, which of course gets more fees for the banks. And that's the only way he can avoid default. So can we find a mechanism that defines banking stability? That's what we're looking at. We're not looking at, in the model, we were not looking for statistical analysis and trend analysis. We were looking, can we understand the mechanism? And more importantly, and this will come up in a minute when I talk about Bill Phillips, can we make it visible to policymakers so that they don't have to take all the hand-waving and math that goes with it? Hand-waving and math, hand-waving maybe doesn't have a place, but math certainly does. But it has to be continually checked against reality. And then there was this marvelous expression that came up during the housing bubble, which is the Minsky moment, which is everybody realizes how stupid they've been, and the market collapses. So now, I'm trying to avoid getting terribly geeky on all of this, but we do have to explain the difference. And if there's any scientists and economists in the audience, they'll give me a hard time. But we're using analog simulation. And what that means is we're using a physical analog. It can use gears, electronics, levers, and fluid flow, and all sorts of things that replicates the behavior of the system you want to study. And the important thing to keep in mind is you have to understand the mechanism to produce the results. Would anybody care to guess when the first really sophisticated analog computer was developed? Anybody?
1,000 years ago.
No, it was 2,100 years ago. And this was the first one that we know about, and it's called the Antikythera device. And it was recovered from a shipwreck. And it was just this corroded mass of gears. But with X-ray tomography, they've been able to reconstruct it, and there's actually working replicas around. And what it does is it's this amazing collection of gears and cams and levers that produces the motion of the 5 planets that the Greeks knew about. It produces the phases of the moon. It corrects the fact that they were using a geocentric model rather than a heliocentric model. And it had a knob on the side, and you turn that and all the planets go around. And on the back there's a calendar so you can predict eclipses and all sorts of other interesting things. But this is, and one of the people who was involved in the restoration back in the UK said, what would happen if somebody threw a laptop off a boat in the Aegean Sea and 2,000 years later tried to figure out what the heck it does? But here they've actually done it. But this brings us to Bill Phillips, who is a fascinating character. He was an electrical engineer, a crocodile hunter, worked in mines, self-taught electrical engineer, who got involved in World War II as an armaments officer with the Royal Air Force. He was captured by the Japanese. He built radios that he hid in the leg of the camp commandant's chair. And the Japanese could not figure out why at 5 o'clock all of the lights in the prison camp would dim. And it turned out that Bill Phillips, with his electrical knowledge, figured he was risking beheading, so it wasn't too much risk to put 2 huge 240-volt cables into a 500-gallon tank of water so he could heat it to brew tea for the whole camp. So anyway, Phillips came to London, and he initially wanted to study sociology because he was fascinated with the dynamics of what had happened to him in the prisoner of war camp. But he got interested in economics, and he said, I don't understand why investment and savings always have to relate. And he went to his professor and said, look, I can do this with a hydraulic device. I can have a tank and you can flow investments into it, and I can have a valve and you can flow savings out of it. And that will effectively integrate your flows with the outflow. So it's actually an integrating calculating device. And I'm going to see if I can find the red pointer on this. And what he did is he constructed this circular flow here, which will get to be important, where here's your working balance at the bottom. It pumps up to the top, and the delight of this thing is he's modeled the banking sector over here. He's modeled the industrial sector with imports and exports over here. And this all prints out income versus time, interest rates, and balance of payments. And it was accurate within about 4% for the British economy. And it was built with World War II surplus components. And this thing is quite famous. Anyway, it does Keynesian economics very well. It does circular flow and such like that. But if you go onto my site on the program there's a link to an article that I was invited to write an article on analog simulation in economics for the OECD, and that article is posted on the website. And there's a marvelous video link in there of Alan McRoby at Cambridge demonstrating a restored Phillips machine. And the best line in it is he's going to show about inflation. So he says, let's turn off the banking sector. And you can literally do that on this model. You can just reach over, disconnect the valves, which are controlled by floats and graphs with slots in them, and see what the economy does without the banking sector. And then the other thing is that we owe this all to Charles Meade, who's a Nobel laureate economist, who actually listened to Phillips, this sort of wild-eyed graduate student coming to him saying, I can do this. And he was the one who came up with, I think, something like 200 pounds to build the model during the summer. So that's the origination of this. But Phillips went on to fame in economics, if you've ever heard of the Phillips curve, which was looking at the relationship between employment and inflation, which is very crucial. But more interesting from my point of view, he was interested in control systems dynamics, and he was on the very early stages of electronic calculation of stability. And he was actually using computers, Short Brothers, the people who built all the big flying boats, he was using their analog simulators to look at stability in economics. So anyway, this brings us up to the analog that we use, which is flow over an airfoil. And I want you to watch how the angle of the airfoil changes, because we've gone one stage beyond Phillips. If you notice there, the flow lines are very close together. At high angles of attack, the model shows that the rich people are getting richer, but they're creating excess drag. And you can actually see here when the model actually stalls. And so we use the physical analog of flow over a cambered surface to model the economy. And, you know, my background is in fluid mechanics, so I can watch this over and over again, but it's just interesting that the flow actually circulates around the airfoil. If you look at it in 3 dimensions, you'll see there's actually a circular flow. And I've had big arguments with this, including cutting out cardboard airfoils and dragging them through a bathtub with pepper sprinkled in it to show that the flow really does circulate. But anyway, here we go, the airfoil, increased angle of attack, you get increased lift, you get more income inequality at the leading edge. It gets high, you see the flow starts to separate at the back. And that means the drag goes through the roof, and then it stalls, and you've got a sudden loss of lift. So we turn that into a model. Now, the question is, how well does it work? And this is one thing that bugs me about a lot of conventional economics and the way it's practiced. They don't go and see how well did my model do against historical data. So here what we have is, this is the CBO time series from 1979 to 2007. Here's the model output. And they only do it in quintiles. We model all the way to the trailing edge of the economy, and that's 32 points. But if you look at this graph here, the smooth curve line is the Cambriant model. The orange line is CBO data. And same here, the different colored lines represent the difference in stability there. And in economic terms, that's actually pretty close. So getting to the subject of the talk here, and here's where it's going to get a little bit geeky. If you remember how the airfoil pitched upwards, there's a position where, depending on where the center of debt burden is on the wing, you've got a stable region, you've got a neutral region that gets progressively unstable, and this is the angle of the wing relative to the flow that you were looking at. And eventually it becomes unstable and stalls. So what we're able to do is model things that way. Now, this is the $2.49 banking stability simulator, And if you'll forgive me for a moment while we put the pieces together here, we're going to see if it replicates the Minsky hypothesis. This has never been done in public before. And what I'm talking about is not flying the models. I'm talking about actually demonstrating the proof of economic modeling and projections in public. We don't see much of that. So what I have is I've got 3 gliders here that the Willow's models, the $2.49. The smaller, cheaper one works almost as well if you're very economically minded. And so what we're doing is we're going to move the balance point backwards and see if it eventually reaches the Minsky moment. And this will also give us an indication of what policy might tell us would be the right course of action to correct it. Now, I very cynically put the pilot looking backwards because he's looking at a historic time series trying to figure out where he's going. And there's a box of these things here, and it's great fun to play with. You can use modeling clay to see what happens when you increase the debt loading. If you put the debt in the right place, it just means you fly faster. But it means you're in trouble if the economy slows up. So anyway, I'm going to warn the AV people over there that I'm not sure how far this is going to go. But here's with a reasonable balance. And the thing to keep in mind is, going back to the picture here, the leverage is what provides part of the stability. In other words, there's a reaction that tries to pitch the airfoil downwards. The weight puts that into an area of the wing where the model is stable, but as you move it back and leave the leverage the same, things get pretty bad. So here we go. We'll see how well it does. Pardon?
Where was the debt on that one?
The debt was all the way forward, so it's pretty stable. Here I've moved the debt back quite a bit, and we'll see how this one does. Does not quite the flatter glide angle there, but it's not quite as efficient. Then we're reaching for the Minsky moment here, and I hope I've got it right, but from a policy simulation point of view, what we... Oh, sorry. I thought I was loud enough, sorry. Here, from a policy point of view, what we can do is we can shift the wing backwards, which reduces the leverage, pitches the nose down to where we end up with a much more stable income. So let's see what happens if we made that policy change. Still pretty good, sorry. Not a good launch, but you can see it doesn't. I'm going to try that. There we go. So what happens is you put people back to work and everything, you immediately regain stability, spending goes up, and all sorts of good things happen, as other speakers have talked about. So our most important thing should be restoring jobs to bring the level of equality back to where it should be. Okay, now here we get into the geeky bit. This is the actual simulation done on the computer model. And what we did here is we kept the production of value, which is essentially the thrust on the model. We're looking at a glider, which is kind of like a mining town that's consuming its resources. It can't increase the total value. And what happens here is we started out at the crash of it, we started out in a stable condition as before '87. We left the production values constant, and the only thing is that we shifted the debt backwards. And then there's a thing called a Dirac impulse that you use to upset models to see if they're stable. And we gave it a swift kick. And that produced the crash of '87. But as you can see, it damped out, and you can see the total asset value is maybe going up just a little bit. That's what all of the complex derivatives brought you as far as increase in actual value. So there's no other inputs on this, so we're just looking at shifting the weight back. And then it gets really scary. Whoops, sorry. It gets really scary when you kick it again, and you get the dot-com crash. Then you get another cycle of the crash of 2008, and then you get the "you are here" moment if you don't change anything. So this model is, we didn't change anything, we didn't have any control input, but the simulation will let you fly the economy, literally. It's an airplane flying through, it's an airplane flying through an atmosphere of transactions. So then the next question is, going back to how are we doing in the real world? Here's the US economy over the same period where we used the model to develop all the force coefficients on it. And this is really interesting because what you can see here, here's the crash of '87, things stabilized out. And this yellow line is the calculated, not the actual cost of production in the economy. So we go along here and we get this peak, a very teeny waver in the line there, and it's stable. And then we start looking at this increase here, and we see the dot-com collapse, and here we see the beginning of the crash of the 2008. And what you can see is that if your growth coefficient, which is how much lift it's developing, is starting to converge with the cost of production, it means somebody's taking more value out of the economy than they're entitled to. And if you go on the website, we've got this for the Swedish economy, which is really interesting to compare the two. But here, the economy's growing, but essentially, what we see is that this is the top 1%. And, you know, it was fairly stable here, but what caused this? And, you know, we can round up the usual suspects there. The net assets of the financial sector just about trebled during this period. And that means they're taking more out of the economy, they're taking more out of the momentum of the airflow than they're entitled to, and actually creating a huge drag on the economy. And this is the other question that I asked economists, which they don't have a good answer, is, okay, the job of the financial sector is to efficiently distribute capital throughout the economy. So if they've increased their net holdings 3 times, why isn't the GDP line going up at the same rate? It's because they're just taking money out of the system and they're not giving us anything back. Now, and this gets into where this really affects public banking, and I'd really like you to think very hard about this. That long-term financing of public investments, as was done in the New Deal, is countercyclic. In other words, it doesn't make the economy zoom up and collapse and go down again. It tends to stabilize things. And throughout history, from the South Sea bubble to the tulip mania to the sovereign debt never defaults, which was in the 60s for a while, all the way through our current crisis, the banks just can't stop themselves from pushing things to increasing their market until they hit the Minsky moment. They do it over and over again. Every 5 to 7 years, you can find a banking crisis somewhere that was caused by the banks overextending and hitting the Minsky moment. And the big thing is that caused that upward sweep of the yellow line is they figured out that we, the public, are going to bail them out. So if you look at how responsive the North Dakota Bank was to regional shocks like the flood, they kept people in their houses by reducing interest on mortgages. They facilitated the flow of money into restoring businesses. The population loss in the cities across just the next state over were huge, whereas North Dakota only lost a couple of % population from its cities during the floods. I think a key point here is that they're the banker's bank there. They provided a lot of the banking services for the small communities rather than forcing them to go to Wall Street. Okay, and then the OECD has some really interesting studies, and it's a short paper, this one, Regional Power, but I think it's really worth reading because what they show is that 4% of regions generate 1/3 of total growth. And we're just not paying attention to the other regions. And then the second paragraph, I think, is really crucial to why people are here at this meeting today. Because if we just depend on top-down solutions out of Washington, as their study showed, and it's a very comprehensive study, They also point out, when they say the study, they're referring to their long-term study, how we frame those challenges are critical. And I like this last sentence. As long as regional policymakers regard external subsidies as the main response to local difficulties, as in Sarah Palin's Bridge to Nowhere, growth is unlikely to be substantial or sustainable. But reframing the policy challenge, looking at it in terms of local partners, institutions, and investment, this is what will encourage real growth in the long term, and that's what we should work on. And anybody who wants to play with the 249 analog simulator, please help yourself to one from the box there. And thank you very much. Any questions?
Have you had any takers from a senior policy level for this?
The model's very new and it's very much a work in progress, but as the model's very new, it's very much a work in progress. The OECD found us at Dominican, which I don't know how that happened. Somebody posted what we were doing on the web, and Patrick Love at OECD found out about it and asked me to write the article, which is also wrapped around the 249 simulator if you want to read that, and that has a lot of useful links in it. So there's some interest in Europe, but if you're not a member of the economics club in the US, it's very hard to get any meaningful audience. It's another bottoms-up thing. Beg pardon?
Is your work a little bit similar to Steve Keen's in Australia?
Who?
Steve Keen.
No. Keen is not looking at analog simulations. His work is interesting, but you have to wade through a lot of math to convince yourself how correct or incorrect it is. But here we're trying to make things so you can literally visualize things. And I want to say one thing about Phillips and his model there. It was a hugely successful educational tool for government and economists in the 50s and 60s in the London School of Economics. And Mead, the Nobel laureate, part of his curriculum was to have one student act in charge of the banking sector as the head of the Bank of England, and the other as the head of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who are responsible for taxation. And what Mead said, that they could never cooperate, so it either ended up with the tank running dry or puddles on the floor from excess inflation. So it shows we really do have to have a coordinated approach.
You said you could actually turn off the banking system and see what happened. What did happen without a banking system?
Well, basically what happened, Basically what happens is you have to set a flow of cash, but you just set that flow of cash is constant. And what it turns out is if you set the flow of cash in the banking sector as constant, and as long as the imports and exports, which are the manufacturing sector, and public demand balance, the economy just goes on happily forever. It becomes very stable. I think there's a lesson in there someplace.
One more question.
So from building a lot of economic models, I know that they break into assumptions. How come you decided that that particular model with the airflow was going to replicate debt and growth, economic growth?
Basically, when you're looking for an analog, you're looking for a physical system that produces the same kind of output as you want to produce. And it turns out that a wing is really good because if you use an airplane flying through transactions, if you use the production of goods as the generation of value as thrust, you use interest and cost of production as drag, and you use debt and maintaining societal structure as weight, and then you as long as the lift is greater than the weight, you can fly that way forever. So I don't know how much of an answer you want there. We can get a lot more technical if you want to talk to me afterwards. But basically, what we're looking for is something that has a complete mechanism. And what happens is the shear in the boundary layer. There's a lot of economic physics people who jam distributions together and say, see, this looks like the wealth distribution in the economy. That's not the mechanism. The mechanism that produced the wealth distribution in this model is literally the shear and momentum in the boundary layer. And as you could see, that really closely replicated the Congressional Budget Office data.
Okay, thank you so much, John.
Okay, thank you.